Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Martine Croxall. This week, our discussion is all about money. Here in the UK, the government has announced the biggest set of tax rises since the Second World War. And the IMF, the World Bank, and in fact banks everywhere, are trying to decide whether they will release Afghanistan's frozen assets and thereby try to avoid a humanitarian disaster. Our guests this week, The Guardian columnist Polly Toynbee, Mina Al-Arabi, the editor-in-chief of the Gulf-based The National newspaper, and still suitably distanced here in the studio with me is the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Welcome to you all. So, to begin with, Boris Johnson's government has announced the largest tax increases in the UK for decades to try to fix the National Health Service and the social care sector. Some say the £36 billion that it will raise over 3 years won't solve the crisis. Other critics say that the tax rises are unfairly distributed. Let's begin then this conversation with Polly. To what extent, Polly, do you believe that what the government is proposing is going to solve the problem with social care, which we've been discussing in this country for years?
Yes, government after government has failed to grasp it. At least this government has come up with something, but the something isn't nearly enough and it doesn't begin to be a plan. Most of the money that it's using will go to compensating richer families who are paying at the moment so that they pay a bit less. They'll still be paying. I think a lot of people are quite shocked to find they're still paying up to £86,000. But at least they get some compensation. Lots of people will still have to sell their homes to pay for their care, though Boris Johnson had promised that nobody would. And there will be very little left over for what's really the most important question, which is the very low quality of care. And nearly 2 million people who are not getting any care, who would have qualified a decade ago, but the threshold has been raised, so they no longer qualify for any care at all. And the care home owners and people who provide care are desperate. They cannot keep their staff, they can't pay their staff enough. What the state pays for each person is much too little. And I'm afraid it doesn't solve any of those. It's a little bit, but probably about the same little bit it's been given every year as a bung to keep it going.
And to begin with, the money's going to go to the NHS anyway, rather than to social care, because the government thinks that there's catching up to do because of the backlog of cases brought about by COVID, where only COVID patients were really being seen in hospital. Simon, we've got this rather unusual situation where we've got a Conservative government in favour of tax increases and a Labour opposition who don't want to see them because, as Polly alluded to there, they don't regard them as being fair, they're being regressive. So what's the alternative?
Well, the phrase that's doing the rounds at the moment is good politics, bad policy, in the sense that the politics of it is that by increasing national insurance, which for UK viewers will know, has a mythology about it, which is that it's some kind of piggy bank you put money in, and that means you'll be looked after in your retirement and beyond. In fact, it's just another tax, and therefore politically raising that is much easier, less problematic than raising income tax. The other part of the problem with the policy is that it is generally being seen as a tax on the young working population to pay for an elderly population closer to needing the kind of services, whether it's in the NHS or whether it's in social care, than the people who are actually being forced to pay for it. And therefore it's been seen as looking after the grey vote, which the Tories think they have a stronghold on, and neglecting younger voters. That's why the Labour Party was in such a difficult position in a way. A lot of people think how can you vote against this when basically government after government, generation after generation, have failed to grasp this nettle. And even some Labour leaders, like Andy Burnham in Manchester, I spoke to yesterday, who's a Labour leader there, said that, they've got to have some credit for trying to take this on, but the mechanism by which they've done it is very, very difficult to justify. The other thing is that it's a huge political moment, because as Polly will probably say more eloquently than I will, the Tories have sold themselves as the business-friendly, low-tax, value for money, making sure you get reforms along the way. And many of their own backbenchers are saying that this marks the end of that era. And and in retrospect will be looked back as a very significant moment in British politics.
But the Chancellor of the Conservative government, Rishi Sunak, surprised a lot of people in how he approached the pandemic, didn't he? You know, by spending huge amounts of money to keep people afloat who were furloughed and keep businesses alive who couldn't open.
Yeah, and I don't think there are as many people out there who would say that was wasted money or he had much choice of doing that. Interesting, I was speaking to one senior business leader with Tory affiliations who said, if you had presented this tax rise as a COVID and furlough payback tax and said to the business community, we've just spent hundreds of billions of pounds paying the wages of most of your staff and keeping businesses afloat, now we need some of that money back, it might have flown a bit better than in this social care health service one. And as you pointed out, originally it was about social care. Most of the money is going to go to the NHS. And some people in Tory backbenchers say the NHS is a very effective sponge to soak up money. It always does. And if you don't do it with reform, there might not be that much left for social care. So
hang on a minute. We're in the middle. We've just had one huge reform and they're about to do another reform. The people who say that are mostly people who don't like the NHS anyway. So they say it's a black hole, it's a sinkhole, it's a sponge. Those are really people who are anti-NHS. The truth about the tax situation is really interesting. For people abroad who might not know this, Britain remains a low tax country compared to our equivalent European countries. Also, the amount of money that we spent on furloughing in the COVID crisis, where every country had to reach into its pockets deep and spend a lot, we spent actually a lot less than America per head, than Germany, than France and other countries. So the idea we've become this wild spendthrift country, as ever, we are, behind most of our equivalents.
Let's talk about the cultural aspects of this, Mina. What would your readers of The National make of this discussion that we've been having in this country for a long, long time about social care, which is what do we do with people who can't look after themselves at any age, but we often think about older people who we put into homes and care homes where they're understaffed, under-resourced. What would their reaction be to how we're dealing with this?
It's a great question, Martine, because it's about how do societies take care of their older citizens. It was interesting, just earlier on, Simon was referencing how politically this is about the grey voter, what happens to the young voter, whereas I think you'll find in other societies, there'll be a sense of obligation to take care of those who are older, who would have worked, who would have paid taxes under different circumstances, and now need to be taken care of. I think the context of social care is not always really understood outside of the UK, but what is understood is the NHS and the idea of free healthcare. When it's compared to other systems around the world, there's a lot of respect towards the NHS and a sense that, yes, they should be, and the NHS should be protected. But I think the point about if this is put within the context of COVID-19, the entire world is looking at ways of how to have their economies recover after COVID-19. However, this is being put more in a political context, very UK-focused domestic politics. And it's interesting to see the initial polling that's come out, the first polling after this, that the Tories actually, since January for the first time, have taken a bit of a hit and are 33% popularity compared to Labour that has gone forward with 35%, again, the first time leading since January. For outside voters, for overseas observers of the UK, that's really interesting because you would think that the Tories saying that they would take care of others, the social care aspect of this, the NHS aspect of it, you wouldn't expect that Labour would actually get a bit of a bump in saying that this is not good enough, more has to be done. But I do think that ultimately the reference to grey voters often is seen as somewhat derogatory for people who are older and actually do deserve a little more care.
And actually bother to turn out and vote in rather high numbers. How much of this, though, Polly, is down to us, the electorate, that we need to be treated like adults, but the politicians are fearful of doing so by saying, look, if you want these services, you're going to have to pay for them somehow. You can only make the current amount of taxes stretch so far.
Well, it's a tiny bit of honesty to have raised taxes at all, so give them a little bit of credit for that. But they have absolutely, as Simon said, been absolutely dishonest as to what kind of tax it is. I mean, the national insurance is nothing that it says it is. And it is the most unjust tax, where what they've ended up doing is getting young, low-paid workers to pay for preserving the wealth of richer older people so that they can keep their homes and pass on their inheritance. And that's mostly paid by people of working age, a lot of whom haven't got homes, haven't got assets and capital. This country is incredibly wealth heavy, particularly in the older generation. And the obvious thing to do is to go for a form of wealth tax, which Labour had proposed back in 2010, wasn't popular then, might not be again. But I think people are coming round to the idea that actually where the wealth is, the broadest shoulders, is where the tax should fall. And I wouldn't be surprised if within a short time, Labour Party has its annual conference coming up, we don't hear some more talk about Labour putting forward taxes that will affect those who have most assets.
I've got a quick question for Polly, if I may, which is that do you think that this Conservatives are storing up a problem and a rod for their own back, given what's happened with education and the allocation of these tax rises for the future?
I think they're going to be in a lot of trouble because it's not just that the money isn't going to cover health, and people really mind about how long the waiting times are to have an operation, and this isn't really going to cover that. But they've made it sound as if they will. They should perhaps have said these are very hard times, this is going to be difficult. Instead of which they've made rather wild promises. I mean, education is still 1% less than it was getting in 2010, and nearly all the other departments apart from defence are going to be hit very hard over the next few years. And this government is pretending to be a spendthrift Father Christmas kind of government, not back to austerity. But austerity is exactly what most government spending is going to feel like in the next few years.
I just wondered whether, Simon and Mina, you've come across many places in the world that would take out insurance policies. You can only do that for your social care if you've got the money. Mina, do you see that around the world?
I do, and I think there's also a question about public debt. The UK's public debt exceeded 100% of GDP last year for the first time since 1963. But there are many countries around the world that are having to deal with public debt, but not really coming up with solutions, because to Polly's point, there are tough political decisions to be made in the long term. And unfortunately, too much of politics in the UK and in too many countries are based on election cycles. People already here are talking about an election that it really isn't due till 2024. And yet people are thinking about how will this reflect in the ballot boxes rather than long-term reforms that will be tough politically.
There are voices on the left, I would say, who would say that actually this is a false debate. With the Rishi Sunak position that we have to keep public debt within 100%, which is the highest, as many has pointed out, for many decades. That actually the reality is that we've got our own currency, we can print as much money as we like, and the Bank of England is actually tacitly funding the UK government. So this is a false choice. That is one point of view which is quite prevalent at the moment. The Treasury would say that's not the case, and everyone says you have to pretend you've got a plan for the public finances just to keep international investors, who by the way lend the UK government this money, you've got to keep them believing that you still believe in fiscal rectitude and cutting your cloth according to your means.
That C word again, confidence.
I think the danger is today we've just had figures showing that growth is practically flatlining. The danger is that by tightening the belt now, by the Treasury winning out in this argument and cutting most of the spending in most departments, you do great harm to the economy. It's exactly what George Osborne did after the great crash after 2010. We need the government to be spending until growth is really well established, and then perhaps pulling back a bit then.
Thank you. Let's move on. Afghanistan is, to use the expression, too big to fail. Warnings abound about it being a safe haven for extremists. There are worries about human rights violations and a deepening crisis of hunger and hardship that will concentrate many minds on trying to find a way to work with the new government, the Taliban, which was announced this week, a government with no female representatives. On top of the list of those seeking to help are the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and banks across the globe planning or perhaps thinking about unlocking Afghanistan's frozen assets to avoid what the Secretary-General of the UN has described as an impending humanitarian disaster. Simon, just how much money belonging to Afghanistan is locked away, and where is it?
Okay, well, there are two different strands to this. One is that the Afghan government was dependent for 40% of its national income on foreign aid, so that's day-to-day spending. So if you cut that off, you've got a serious problem. The other one is that they had about $9 to $10 billion of foreign currency reserves, and what countries generally do with that is they use that to manage the value of their own currency in international markets. That has been frozen, and what that can do is send currencies into free fall, and you get sort of hyperinflation. Now, we've seen a bit of that, but perhaps not as much as we thought. So the question for the international community now is exactly how economically do you approach the new Taliban government? Now, if you play hardball and say we're going to freeze this, then you risk a humanitarian crisis. If you don't, then you risk, in a way, economically legitimizing and recognizing the government in place. So this, yes, they do have some leverage. How you play it is an incredibly difficult diplomatic position, which I don't think countries around the world are in. There's any consensus on how to do that yet.
No, indeed. What are the opinions you're hearing then, Mina? Because if you don't release these assets, it is the general population that will suffer. They're going hungry. Many people have tried to leave the country because they don't want to live in that regime. As Simon says, the leverage is there, but it's not obvious how you use it.
Well, what are the levers that are there? So part of it is this recognition element, and that if assets are released, then it's a recognition of the government implicitly, but also there is the leverage of aid and where aid is being sent. And actually, the one point that the Taliban should be hearing is that aid is going directly to Afghans who need it most. Half of the Afghan population relies on aid from abroad, and 75% of that population are women and children. And frankly, there are NGOs, local Afghan NGOs, that have been working for over the last 18 to 19 years, and they should be the ones that are enabled. If the international community wanted to think of a way to get aid to those Afghans who need it, they should say that those NGOs, what remains of them, of course, some are in hiding, some of their members have fled because they're concerned, but many still are on the ground. So they should be enabled, be it the UK or the US or others. They've worked with some of these local entities, and they can turn around and use some of that leverage, turn to the Taliban government and say, we want to work with those partners who we've trusted, where we know where any funding and money comes will go directly to those people. So I think it could be actually quite a healthy channel to try to establish, not to leave Afghanistan behind. And one of the biggest concerns, of course, to your point about the evacuations and the refugees, is now that the evacuations have really ended, people will stop paying attention. Some countries have already started an air corridor, an air bridge of aid. The UAE, for example, has already announced it sent 7 flights with medical aid and humanitarian assistance, and said that they will continue. And there are other regional countries that are saying that they will continue with humanitarian aid until there's a clearer international position.
Polly, a lot was talked about hopes of a different type of Taliban. We've seen journalists beaten up for trying to report about these peaceful protests where women have bravely gone onto the streets to say, what about us? What about our position in society? How realistic is it, though, to attach good governance, make human rights principles central to the Taliban receiving help from the international community?
Well, yes, goodness, aren't those women astoundingly brave? You look at them with such admiration, but they will be intimidated and sent home. For the time being, we don't really know. And I think the evidence from the reporters on the ground is that the Taliban itself, isn't one thing. There are those who want to be Taliban more moderate, and there are quite a lot of people who've just been fighters all their life and have very sort of primitive views, really, about revenge and also a very austere and puritanical kind of government. Certainly, no women visible. So we don't know. But what really matters at this moment is that we don't let there be a humanitarian catastrophe. If there was a mighty famine now, it would be very hard to heal anything in Afghanistan, or to, try and help the people there, to whom we do have a strong moral obligation. I think that in Britain, one of the things that we can offer is some of our experience of making peace in Northern Ireland, where you have entirely opposed groups and bringing them around the table and eventually coming to some kind of power sharing agreement, some kind of modus vivendi. Won't be satisfactory, won't be everything we would want, but just about enough so that they can get the aid, they can have the money released. There will be some reckoning about, a more widely acknowledged, broad-based government, not just a Taliban government. I think that's within the realms of possibility, but only if we act very fast to help now. If we are vengeful and allow a terrible famine to happen, there'll be no influence left. It'll be too late.
I don't think it's in the Taliban's interest to have a famine or a massive food shortage. They want to be seen as a competent government. And at the top levels, they want to be seen, as our colleague Lise Doucette put it, they want to move from guns to government. Now, they have some other sources of revenue. There's obviously the opium trade, potentially selling mining rights to China. And some of that has been done in the past. Now, that was enough to run an insurgency. Possibly. It's certainly not enough to run a government. But the idea that I think the Taliban might be very sympathetic to the idea of a multinational humanitarian assistance program, because they do not want to be seen to be running a government which is failing catastrophically to the detriment of its own people.
But it's immediately, as soon as the Taliban took over, Simon, it was pointed out by a lot of commentators that China and Russia see opportunity.
There is huge mineral resources. There's big marble deposits. There'll be no shortage of people queuing up to examine the opportunities there. I think one of the other problems is, and I'm no Afghan expert, believe me, but it's one of those things which we've seen in terms of the conflicts we've seen over the last few decades. The idea of a centralised government which knows exactly which bits, which extremities, what they're doing. Some people have compared it to a sort of, narco gangster state or what have you. And certainly it's full of regional people who often have different agendas to anyone who's talking to the press, the international press at the centre. So the idea that you can reason with one entity which has control over the whole country, I think, is probably a bit naive.
I mean, how concerned are
the state? Can I just say this? One quick thought. You mentioned the narco-gangster state. We could deal with that very quickly. If we had a sensible non-prohibition attitude towards drugs in the West, we cut that trade immediately.
Polly, we're struggling to hear you a little bit. I'm hoping that the picture and the sound will settle down so we can hear from you again in a moment. Mina, in terms of the concerns about proxy conflicts within Afghanistan, regional powers, neighbours looking into the country and thinking that they could use the chaos to their own advantage, how big a concern is that?
It is a very big concern, but I just want to go back to the point about Russia and China. Russia and China decided to keep their embassies open. Russia and China have already continued talks with the Taliban, but so has the United States in terms of continuing talks with the Taliban. They were the ones, let's not forget, who started talks with the Taliban without any of these assumptions about human rights or what sort of representation. So I'm afraid it's a little late to be talking about some of these points. The British government and other governments could have chosen from Western Europe and, of course, the US, could have chosen to have at least kept some diplomatic representation in Kabul. Instead, they all left. And so if the Chinese and the Russians are to take advantage of that, I really think we have to pause before we blame them, where on the contrary, you've had countries like the United States that just decided it was time to leave, regardless of what the consequences would be on the ground. As for the regional powers, of course, everyone is not only going to seek their own interests, but they're also concerned about the security developments on the ground. There are reports already of different foreign fighters possibly heading towards Afghanistan. But at the same time, those regional entities were already wreaking havoc inside of Afghanistan for the past 2 decades and even before that. So it's not something new, so to speak. What is new is that the Taliban, as Simon was saying, is going to try to prove that they can govern, and they're going to have a very difficult time in doing that. They could have shown a bit more goodwill with the cabinet that they uncovered. It seems that no, the cabinet is going to be filled with hardliners and with people who don't really seem to believe in power sharing at this point. but also because they feel that they've won. The way that the United States conducted its withdrawal and conducted its talks with the Taliban allowed them to have that sense of success, but also not really feel that there's a need to negotiate, at least at this point. So again, when we look at the aid issue, this is the time to say local entities on the ground, the regional, domestic different governance, give them a bit more autonomy by having aid delivered there. If that's possible, that could be a way to get back to some sort of negotiation process, but also enable some of the local actors there and give them a bit more agency.
Simon, just very briefly, if the leverage with the assets doesn't work, the Americans are already talking about drone strikes if terrorism starts to flare up again.
I mean, that's the unknown question. The Taliban have said that they are not going to be a tent under which terrorist organisations can gather. Obviously, the invasion in the first place was because Al-Qaeda found succour and shelter within Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. We just don't know.
That's all we have time for this week. Our thanks to Polly Toivy, Mina Al-Arabi and Simon Jack. Do join us again next week. Same time, same place. It'll be me again, I think. Bye-bye.